Good evening. I'm Marcia Biederman, and I'm here to talk about my book, Scan Artist: How Evelyn Wood Convinced the World That Speed Reading Worked. And I want to thank you for joining me, and I want to thank the Westport Museum for History and Culture for inviting me to be here. Speed reading, it was generally believed to be a real thing 60 years ago. I was around at the time, and I hope some of you were too, and I'd love to hear your comments, whether you were alive then or you from a younger generation. We're inviting people to post comments, which I'll address at the end of this. And I think it's a timely subject because speed reading never actually happened as a thing. If it had, right now, the many people who say that they hope to do more reading during the lockdown, the stay-at-home orders, actually wouldn't need this extra time to do reading because they'd be polishing off a book a day if only they applied themselves to an 8-week course that was offered throughout the country and in many other nations, and it became very, very popular from 1961 for more than 10 years, well into the 70s, and was generally believed, especially when the program launched, that if you took an Evelyn Wood course, your only problem during this pandemic, during the stay-at-home orders, would be that you'd finish every book on your shelf, and then you'd find that you couldn't go to the bookstores, the libraries to get more. Maybe you'd try loading up your ebook, but you'd probably overload your e-reader too, because at that time, a high school girl who had taken an Evelyn Wood course went on to a national game show, I've Got a Secret, which was, very, very popular at the time. And her secret was that she had read Gone with the Wind in an hour. And for comparison's sake, if you look at the Amazon Kindle e-reader, they will give you information about each book with an estimate of the typical time to read that book. And today's estimations, it would take the typical Kindle reader 16 and a half hours to read Gone with the Wind. And Evelyn Wood Advertising said that after a course, you could read The Godfather in 1 hour, 4 minutes. But today's Kindle estimate is that it would take you 9 hours and 22 minutes. So what happened? When Evelyn Wood came on the scene, and I'll tell you more about her soon, she couldn't believe that we'd be reading the way our grandparents did. She said that her grandparents had used a horse and buggy, and she was taking jets, and it was inconceivable to her that we'd continue reading the way our grandparents had. But it looks like we are. Most of us, even college-educated people, are estimated to read about 250 words a minute. And I'm talking about reading, not skimming, because the Evelyn Wood Reading Dynamics Company always said in all their advertising, we're not teaching skimming, we're really teaching reading. So I want to read a portion from my book, which starts at the time that Evelyn was at the high point in her career, although her high point lasted for quite a while. So this is the prologue. The big stories of the 1961 National Education Association Convention were supposed to be about federal aid to education and school desegregation. But a middle-aged teacher from Utah and her pubescent student grabbed the headlines instead. It was June 26th, the first real working day of the week-long event, following its official Sunday opening with the read-aloud of a message from President John F. Kennedy. At this point, the press area of the Atlantic City Convention Hall had produced plenty of soiled coffee cups, but few typewritten pages. JFK in absentia did not make good copy. Today's advanced transcripts of the evening speech by Jonas Salk seemed equally inauspicious. The legendary medical researcher had no new discoveries to report. However, the news hounds soon found a suitable equivalent. Hard-nosed as they liked to seem, most journalists present were pushovers for a new kind of snake oil. The information explosion was in full swing, and millions of words were gushing out. Reporters and other professionals of the era were gripped with self-doubt. How could they keep up? The Atlantic City Convention promised a seaside cure. Listed in the program is simply Wood Dynamic Reading Process. Evelyn N. Wood, Assistant Professor of Reading, University of Delaware, Newark, Delaware. It was one of dozens of presentations offered to the 10,000 delegates in the cavernous convention hall. But Evelyn turned it into the main event. Short, middle-aged, and invariably described as a school teacher, with all the dullness that implied, Evelyn played the part of MC before an audience of 150. The stars were two Wilmington, Delaware high school students trained by Evelyn in what she called her revolutionary reading method. Audience members were invited to choose a book from a stack of volumes never before seen by the youths. Each student, in turn, would have 3 minutes to tear through a section and report on the contents. A stopwatch ticked, and the audience gaped as a 17-year-old Robert Darling ripped through 120 pages, running his finger down each before turning to the next. He closed the book to deliver a detailed summary that drew exclamations from his dazzled listeners. He spoke for 15 minutes, 5 times as long as he'd spent reading. Science has since shown that such free recall testing is subject to fabrication. No coarser technology has produced outside gains in reading speed without sacrificing comprehension. Readers who skip or scan might try to fill in missing pieces through inference, but this is skimming, and decades of experimentation have shown its abysmal effects on grasping an author's intended meaning. Speed reading marketers still flourish on the internet, but federal regulators have stopped some from making extraordinary promises. In 1961, however, Evelyn had a nervous world in her palm. She opened the floor to questions and let the young man explain her method. Reading down the page rather than across it allowed him to absorb concepts and thoughts rather than individual words, he said. He credited her for his prowess, eliminating any need for her to blow her own horn. "Tell him how many books you've finished in this past year, Bob," prompted another youth in the Wood entourage. 7,000, Darling reportedly replied, prompting sharp inhalations of breath and much scribbling in reporters' notebooks. Louise Maru, also 17, got her own turn to demonstrate. She nearly matched Bob's rate and did it in French, a language she'd studied for only 1 year in high school, the audience was told. But by then, the news people were mentally composing lead paragraphs, racing back to the typewriters, phones, and coffee urns provided by the NEA to facilitate coverage of more consequential issues. They filed breathless reports on the Wood method. 120 pages in 3 minutes, read the headline of an Associated Press wire piece run in dozens of papers, sometimes under other titles like Bookworm Turns, pages a second, and NEA agog at boys' skill. The, quote, revolutionary reading method raised gasps of astonishment, unquote, wrote the Chicago News Service, while a Eureka, California paper quoted a local educator who called it the high spot of the convention. If Bob Darling was the reading wizard, Evelyn was the half-hidden woman behind the curtain, pulling the strings, but not demanding we pay no attention to her. All her life she'd sought the limelight, as a prize-winning orator in junior college and a champion university debater, as the wife of the president of an overseas Mormon mission, and as director, playwright, and lyricist of an elaborate pageant and a cast of an elaborate pageant staged with special effects and a cast of 1,000 in Salt Lake City's Mormon Tabernacle. So, I hope that you're seeing this because I am not seeing the the comments yet, but maybe nobody has registered any. So I'm going to continue by asking myself some questions. So let's see, maybe because comment moderation isn't set. Okay. I just don't see any comments yet. So let me be my own questioner. So why did you write this book? I wrote it because I am an Evelyn Wood graduate, but not a successful one. I took the course myself in 1967 in Los Angeles when I was 19 years old, and I was a college student feeling very overwhelmed by the reading load. I was an English major, and sheepishly, I had to recognize at the end of the course that I was not reading any faster than I had at the beginning, but I thought it was me, which was a common phenomenon in those courses, and just didn't discuss it with my classmates, most of whom I didn't have much in common with anyway, because they were mostly businessmen. Men always outnumbered women in these classes, partly because some of them were compensated by their companies for taking it. Corporate America was very sold on it, and did reimbursement. They had Evelyn Wood courses taught on their premises. And of course, the U.S. Congress also, the House of Representatives, had a class that was held right in a hearing room in the Capitol. And then later, Senator Ted Kennedy organized a class for senators up in the Senate. So I was, just looking back on it, I was so intrigued by this craze that had, or really a trend, because it lasted longer than a craze, it lasted longer than the hula hoop, that had taken hold of the country and had been originated by a woman. My previous biography was about a restaurateur named Patricia Murphy, who had a fabulous chain of restaurants called Patricia Murphy's Candlelight Restaurants. And I felt she was an overlooked businesswoman, and I thought that Evelyn Wood also was. And I wasn't sure whether the method worked or just hadn't worked for me. So I started out with an open mind and an eagerness just to find out more about this. And then I did find out that it didn't work. So the next question is, did Evelyn know that it didn't work? Because I'm calling the book Scan Artist. And what I'll say is that not every scam has someone behind it like P.T. Barnum. By the way, P.T. Barnum was the mayor of Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is near Westport, and that's my hometown. And P.T. Barnum said a sucker was born every minute, and he just, we can imagine him just rubbing his hands and thinking of ways to swindle people. I don't think that Evelyn Wood intended to do that at the beginning. She was an adjunct at the University of Utah teaching a class in reading improvement that was required of some of the entering freshmen, but she didn't originate speed reading. Speed reading was very popular at the time. So in 1957, the Wall Street Journal did an overview of how many speed reading courses were available. This before Evelyn Wood offered her course. And people were using machines to speed up their reading. There was a lot of interest in it. So she was teaching this course, and she did not use machines. What was unusual about her is she had, as you can see on the cover of my book, people just run their fingers down the page as a pacer. And for a while, there were different hand movements, sometimes this way and sometimes this way. And that was supposed to speed you up and actually train your eyes to read fast, your eyes and your brain, in a way that she never really explained. It was all supposed to come together so that you weren't reading individual words, you weren't saying the words to yourself. Science has proved, this is really settled science, that it didn't work and it was skimming. And there's eye tracking technology. There was then, when Evelyn was was first marketing her idea, and there is now very sophisticated eye tracking technology that shows that the people trained in this method their eye movements are exactly like scanners. They're missing a lot of things. If they're very clever and it's a nonfiction book, they might be able to combine it with their prior knowledge and and sound like they're summarizing a book accurately. But it didn't work, and I think this became evident immediately because after Evelyn and her business partners, including her husband, commercialized it, there quickly were people debunking the method who were based in universities. And if she never meant to hoodwink people in the first place, she certainly became part of the corporate machinery at Evelyn Wood Reading Dynamics to try to squelch critics, threaten them with lawsuits for defamation. She and her partners refused to let any third parties test their students. She suppressed some results done by a colleague that were not favorable to the method. So did she know it didn't work? Maybe not at first, but once it became commercialized, she saw what she wanted to see. She did not object to attacks on her critics who were using evidence and science to say her method didn't work. So I'll leave it there. Why is Evelyn's life a good story? Very much because she had these debunkers to deal with from the beginning. I mean, the early part of her life is that she liked getting attention. She was very interested in drama. So I think the story is very much a woman trying to be heard at that time. And I do sympathize with her because women's voices were not heard. She was born in 1909, a champion debater in 1929, but she got married straight out of college and then subsumed herself to her husband's career. For a while, he was rising very fast in Mormon church circles, and he was given an extremely important post when he was in his early 30s. She was also in her 30s. They were in 1938. They were sent to head up the West German Mormon mission, and there were a lot of conversions to Mormonism in Germany at the time. So they were doing very well. The first president of the church visited them. This is, the equivalent of the Pope. And then everything fell apart when Hitler invaded Poland. They had to come back. They had intended to stay in Europe for years. They had been running a grocery store. They had sold out. They had rented out their house, everything. They had to start from scratch when they came back from Europe. And I think that she wanted to build a career for not just for herself, but for her husband. Because after the grocery store, he tried the appliance business and did well for a while, but then he didn't do well. And she really created a job for him with with Evelyn Wood Reading Dynamics. So that's interesting. And she also, I think, had been affected by her father too, who she loved. She loved her father and her husband very much, but they didn't have stability in their work lives. And she knew how to organize stability. She had this great idea, even if you just look at it as a marketing idea. It met the needs of the time. Everyone was panicked. We were in the throes of the Cold War. Sputnik went up. America thought they couldn't keep up. People were building fallout shelters. There was a lot of fear and anxiety, and reading faster was a way to keep up with people at work and other college students and just succeed and do well. So, and the fact that debunkers kept trying to drag her down, people with credentials from Harvard, from Columbia, and she just kept going. Everyone trusted her face. she was just great at what she did. Her face appeared in ads all over newspapers. At that time, there were thousands and thousands of American newspapers, and they'd run these full page ads with her face in it, and it was a face that people believed. She became like Betty Crocker, except that Betty Crocker was always a fictitious person. Evelyn Wood was very much alive. Yes, and Nicole, I see that you're asking a question. I'll get to that later. What's the Westport connection? The Westport connection is that for a while the company, it changed hands. Evelyn and her husband and some partners incorporated it in Delaware and operated mostly out of Washington at the very beginning. But although there was huge press about it all the time, and it was very respected, and it was not a marginal fringe idea, Evelyn Wood speed reading. It was discussed on an ABC News show that was moderated by someone who had moderated the Nixon-Kennedy debates. It was widely believed that this was the real thing. So, but the business model wasn't working. It was for business people, and the Evelyn Wood Reading Dynamics institutes, as they call them, were in high rent places with beautiful furniture. Think Mad Men. It was, the rents were high. The teachers were paid decently, at least at first, and it was overwhelming. Doug Wood, Evelyn's husband, and they looked for someone to sell it to. Evelyn was also she was ruining her health. She had an overactive thyroid, and she was just dragging herself to work, and finally she couldn't get herself out of bed. So they found, actually their business manager found a group of investors and to buy it for an undisclosed amount of money. And that group of investors sold it to Famous Artist School, which was headquartered in Westport. There used to be all these artists and writers working out of cubicles on the Saugatuck River. And Famous Artist Schools had taught visual arts. Norman Rockwell was supposedly connected with the school, and then there were famous writers, had a host of famous people connected with that, until an expose brought it down, because the famous writers actually had nothing to do with giving feedback on students' work. It was just Westport people who found jobs at famous artist schools were doing it. Not with big names. At any rate, Famous Artist School bought Evelyn Wood Reading Dynamics for over $7 million, which would be like a huge amount of money today. And this was in '67. And they kept it going, and they kept the advertising going, but they were losing money on it too. And then it kept changing hands. But the turnaround artist was a Westport man who recently passed away. I interviewed his house in Westport. This was Tommy Thompson, Maurice Thompson Jr. He was just a genius. He bought it from Famous Artist School, and along with two venture capitalists who I think also lived in Westport, and they really turned the whole thing around. And they were young at the time, as you could see in the picture, and the people involved with Evelyn Wood were all young. Here's another one. This is the photo this is staged. The son of the man in this picture told me he was the president of the Evelyn Wood subsidiary, the James DeSantis at the time, and he was not an instructor. And all these people are probably executives involved with the franchises. Evelyn and her husband, who were devout Mormons and teetotalers, would come to parties in Westport and just feel a little awkward. Then, let's see how we're doing with time. Is the course still taught today? Well, one could look for Evelyn Wood materials, but for legal reasons, I'm not going to address myself to that. There are other things on the internet that are all being taught, but again, I'm writing about Evelyn's wife and focusing on this company mostly during her lifetime, even after she and her husband sold it. Evelyn was always the public face. She remained a consultant. She was on the payroll, and she, I'll confine myself to that. So we have someone here from Brazil. Thank Eloisa. So good to see you. Let's see. I will continue with my own questions and answers, but please, ask me some if you're watching. Some readers say the method worked for them. Did that surprise you? No, it didn't. And actually, I was at the Westport Museum for History and Culture in November, and one of the audience members said that she thought it was great. And usually what people say is that it was great, but you had to practice it all the time, so they're not still using it. So, listen, I can't deny any one person's experience, but I would say that any evidence that it worked, I would like people to consider whether they were really skimming and not reading. And the other thing is, because they say they don't use it anymore, it would be hard to test them. So I think right now with coronavirus, it's important to consider what is science. It has to be evidence-based. There have to be controlled experiments. And eventually, Evelyn Wood graduates did become part of controlled experiments. People who swore that the course worked for them were tested, not with Evelyn's consent, but on their own. They volunteered to participate in other tests, and their comprehension was terrible. And sometimes I didn't realize that. And I think one of the most, if you just want to go by anecdotes, the Saturday Evening Post published one of Evelyn's critics in 1962. And what he had done is he had taken an article from a magazine, and two articles, and he had interspersed the lines. So he gave this text to people who said that they used the Evelyn Wood method and it was terrific. And there was one line, they were interposed lines. He called it a mishmash. And they read this mishmash, and they didn't notice that it was absurd. And there was another person in the experiment who hadn't taken the course and was reading normally, and he said, whoever wrote this is nuts. It doesn't make any sense. But the Evelyn Wood, the people using her technique hadn't noticed that. So that says it all if you just want to rely on anecdotes. Let's see. How of my own questions. How did you research the book? I was very lucky that the university, not the University of Utah, though they helped me too, but the Utah Historical Society had archived about 23 boxes full of writing and business correspondence from Evelyn Wood reading dynamics and the personal love letters that were exchanged between Evelyn and her husband, Doug, and a lot of letters that Evelyn wrote from Germany. It's just wonderful to have material that your biographical subject actually composed. I could get into Evelyn's mind that way. So I could see that. It was just a glorious thing to research. The University of Utah was also very, very helpful. There were hundreds of newspaper articles about the course. There were scientific studies of the method. So I had a wealth of very interesting material. And I was able to talk to one of her demonstrators, Bob Darling. And if you saw the beginning of this video where I read about the demonstration at the National Education Association convention, Bob Darling was then at that point, the young man who could read, uh, he, supposedly he could read thousands of words a minute. I think he's a very, very smart man. He still believes that the method worked for him, and then he was demonstrating how he read. He's a charming, charming guy. He was very generous with his time, and other people who knew Evelyn, who had worked with her, and a lot of people respected her very much. Uh, yeah, as a boss, as a friend, as a teacher. So, and what's the takeaway? What's the takeaway? So I think it's be cautious. There are a lot of miracle cures, treatments being suggested, and I think as if we were sick, if we did have COVID-19, and someone in my family did luckily recover, a younger person, from this horrible disease. But if all else failed, I think we would be tempted to try something that has been proven only anecdotally, but that, as has happened with hydroxychloroquine, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the side effects have been found to be very harmful. So we have to be careful with science, but we also, I think I also learned about what a woman who is dead set on providing a stable future for herself and her husband, what lengths she went to. So, it's 5:31, so I'm so happy that you were here with me, and I hope you'll get my book, and thank you so much. Bye.